Maybe you should eat in the kitchen, my son-in-law said softly when I tried to pull out a chair at the Easter table I had been cooking for since 6:30 that morning. My name is Elena Whitaker. I'm 63. Have you ever realized you were a guest in your own house, while everyone else acted like you didn't belong there? For a moment the room kept moving like nothing had happened. Silverware clinked. Someone laughed at a joke I hadn't heard. The smell of honey-glazed ham still hung in the air, warm and sweet, like it was trying to pretend everything was normal. But I noticed things. My daughter didn't look up from her wine glass. My grandson stared down at his plate like the mashed potatoes might start talking. And the chair. The one at the head of the table. It sat there quietly, like it had been waiting all evening to see whether I would take it. I untied my apron slowly, folding it once, twice, placing it on the back of the chair I'd been told not to use. Then I walked to the head of the table. Every step sounded louder than it should have. I looked around the room, at the people eating food I had cooked in the house I had paid for. And that's when I understood something strange. Sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive with shouting. Sometimes it sits down first, and waits for you to notice. The silence that followed felt thicker than the gravy cooling on the table. I rested my hand on the back of the head chair. The wood was warm, like it still remembered every holiday dinner I had hosted for the past 20 years. No one spoke. My son-in-law Daniel cleared his throat softly. The same polite little sound he always made before saying something that wasn't polite at all. "Elena, we just thought it might be easier if you ate in the kitchen tonight," he said, forcing a smile. "You know, less crowded." Less crowded. I glanced around the room. My dining table seated 8. There were 6 people sitting there. 2 empty chairs. One of them was mine. Across the table my daughter Melissa finally looked up. Her lips pressed into a tight line, the kind people wear when they've already agreed with someone else but don't want to say it out loud. A fork scraped against a plate. My neighbor Linda leaned toward her husband and whispered something under her breath. The chair at the head of the table creaked slightly as I pulled it back. Not loudly. Just enough. Daniel's smile disappeared. "Elena, that seat is for..." I looked at him. Really looked at him. And suddenly I remembered the moment 3 months ago when he'd asked a question about the house that didn't feel like a question at all. That was the first time I realized Daniel wasn't just visiting my home. He was slowly trying to own it. 3 months earlier, it had started with a simple question. We were standing in the kitchen. Melissa was upstairs putting the baby down for a nap, and Daniel was leaning against the counter, casually spinning a house key around his finger. "You ever thought about downsizing, Elena?" he asked. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming behind us. The sunlight coming through the window made the dust in the air look like tiny floating stars. "Downsizing?" I repeated. He smiled that small polite smile of his. "You know, maybe a smaller place. Less work for you. You've done enough." At the time it almost sounded thoughtful. But something in his tone didn't sit right. The kitchen chair beside us creaked softly. For a strange second, it looked like it was waiting for someone else to sit there. Someone who already believed the house belonged to them. Melissa came back downstairs then, clapping her hands together. "Dinner smells amazing, Mom." Daniel slipped the key into his pocket. The moment passed. Or at least I thought it had. Now, standing at the head of my own Easter table, I realized that question had never really been a question. It had been a test. And tonight, Daniel clearly believed he had already passed it. He leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Elena," he said quietly, "let's not make this uncomfortable." I smiled. Because that was the exact moment I decided to make it unforgettable. I lowered myself into the head chair slowly. The wood creaked, the way old houses sometimes sigh when they recognize the person who actually belongs there. No one touched their food. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Elena," he said again, softer this time, "we already talked about this." "No," I replied calmly. I listened. Across the table Melissa shifted in her seat. Her fingers wrapped around her wine glass like she needed something to hold on to. "Mom, please don't start something tonight," she murmured. "It's Easter." Easter. The word hung in the air like a decoration that suddenly didn't match the room. I reached toward the center of the table and straightened the small white candle I had placed there that morning. Its flame flickered, thin and steady. For years that candle had been my quiet tradition. Lighted before dinner. A reminder that family meant warmth. Tonight the flame looked different. Not warmer, just clearer. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Look, he said, his voice patient in that practiced way. Melissa and I have been discussing some things about the house. There was. Not your house. Just the house. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. I know. And judging by the way his expression changed, Daniel had just realized something uncomfortable. I knew a lot more than he thought. Daniel's fingers tapped lightly on the table, a quiet, restless rhythm against the wood. You know, he repeated, trying to sound casual. I folded my hands in front of me and looked at the candle again. The small flame trembled, reflecting in the silverware like tiny mirrors. Yes, I said gently. About the paperwork. Melissa's head snapped up. What paperwork? The room shifted. You could feel it in the silence, like the air had leaned forward to listen. Daniel forced a laugh. Elena, that's not really something we need to get into right now. But I continued anyway. 3 weeks ago, I said calmly, someone tried to add a co-owner to my property title. Melissa blinked. What? Daniel's chair scraped slightly against the floor. It was probably just a misunderstanding with the bank, he said quickly. We were only trying to help you manage things. Help. Such a soft word. But I still remembered the phone call from my attorney. The pause in his voice when he asked, Did you authorize this request, Mrs. Whitaker? Across the table, Melissa looked between us, confusion slowly spreading across her face. Daniel, she whispered, what is she talking about? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the candle in the center of the table like it had suddenly become very interesting. And that was when I reached into the pocket of my apron. Because the envelope inside it had been waiting all evening. The envelope made a soft sound as I placed it beside the candle. Just paper touching wood. But the room reacted like something heavy had landed there. Daniel's eyes flicked down to it for a split second, then back to me. Elena, he said carefully, there's no need to do this in front of everyone. His voice had changed. Less confident now. Across the table, Melissa looked pale. Mom, what's in the envelope? I didn't answer her right away. Instead, I smoothed the edge of the paper with my thumb, feeling the small ridge where it had been sealed earlier that afternoon. The chair beside Daniel shifted slightly as Linda adjusted in her seat. She whispered something to her husband, but even that whisper sounded too loud in the quiet room. 3 weeks ago, I said softly, my attorney called me about a request someone made at the county office. I slid the envelope an inch closer to Daniel. A request to put Daniel Carter's name on the deed to my house. Melissa inhaled sharply. Daniel didn't touch the envelope. But I saw the moment his shoulders stiffened. You're misunderstanding, he said quickly. It was only meant to help with future planning. In case something ever happened to you. Something about that sentence made the candle flame flicker hard. I leaned forward slightly. That's interesting, I said. Because what's inside that envelope happened 3 days before you filed that request. Daniel finally reached for it. And the second his fingers touched the paper, I knew the evening had just taken a turn he hadn't planned for. Daniel's fingers trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside were copies of the official county documents. His request to be added as co-owner, stamped and signed, alongside my attorney's letter confirming I had never authorized it. The room went still. Melissa gasped softly. Daniel, you did what? He swallowed hard. I thought. I let him struggle for words while I watched the ripple of realization spread across the table. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Linda's hand hovered over her husband's arm, unsure whether to intervene. I reached for the candle and tilted it slightly, letting the flickering flame dance across the papers. The light caught on the inked signatures like a spotlight on his deception. 3 weeks, I said, voice calm, controlled. 3 weeks you tried to quietly take what was mine. Daniel's jaw tightened. It was never. Never what? I interrupted softly. Yours to take. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. Dad would have never. Mom, I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then I smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not one meant to wound. A quiet, knowing smile. I'll handle it, I said. And you, I looked directly at Daniel, will understand why it's not always what you think you control that matters. He swallowed again, and for the first time I saw fear. Not the fear of punishment but the fear of exposure of his own betrayal laid bare. The table felt smaller now. The room colder. The Easter dinner, entirely transformed. I stood slowly, letting the chair creak under me one last time. The envelope stayed where it was, open like a quiet accusation. Melissa reached for my hand, trembling. "Mom, what will you do?" I looked around the table at all the faces. The relatives who had acted as though I was invisible, the neighbors who had watched politely, Daniel frozen in his seat. "Do?" I echoed softly. "I'll do what's always been mine to do." Over the next hour I spoke quietly, calmly, laying out every small detail. The legal steps Daniel had tried to take, the paperwork he had forged, the signatures he had assumed I wouldn't check. Each revelation landed like a soft echo, but it grew louder with every word. By the time the meal ended, Daniel understood. Not humiliation, not anger, but the cold weight of accountability. He would not get the house. He would not manipulate my family. He had underestimated me. I looked at the candle again. Its flame had steadied, small and unyielding. It had watched the betrayal, the silence, and now the quiet victory. Melissa squeezed my hand and I felt the warmth of my family returning, not because of the meal or the holiday or even the apology, but because truth had been restored. I smiled, finally, feeling the release of control returning to my hands. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it just lights a candle, waits, and lets the truth shine.